So good morning, everybody. It's really great to have you here again. So I'm happy you came back this morning. So how can we start this conference without talking about Canada-US relations, right? Our relationship with the United States is critical to so many of our members and nearly all manufacturers in Canada. So I can attest to that. I'm from 3M, and we have significant operations on both sides of the border. And more than 75% of what we sell in Canada is imported from the US, and more than 75% of what we make in Canada actually is exported to the US. And as President Biden so rightfully said during his visit to Canada earlier this year, we were reminded by our distinguished guests earlier this week that our destinies are intertwined and inseparable, not because of our geography, because it's a choice. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome our opening keynote. So before his appointment by President Biden and unanimous confirmation, which is not easy to do, by the way, in the US, by the US Senate and US Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen served as Senior Advisor to the CEO at Comcast Corporation as of January 1st, 2020. He was previously Senior Executive Vice President at Comcast, where his portfolio included corporate communication, legal affairs, government and regulatory affairs, public affairs, corporate administration, corporate real estate and security, and community impact. David Cohen also served as the company's first Chief Diversity Officer. Before starting with Comcast in July 2002, David Cohen served as a partner and chairman of Ballard, Spahr, Andrews, and Ingersoll, one of the 100 largest law firms in the country. From January 92 to 97, he served as Chief of Staff to the Honorable Edward Randall, the Mayor of the City of Philadelphia. Please join me in welcoming the United States Ambassador to Canada, Ambassador David Cohen.
So good morning, everyone. For everyone in the audience, you'll note that the way this has been set up is we're going to mimic a tennis match. You go from one side to the other side, but I've been assigned the right side podium, and I hope that's not a reflection of political views, but just of geography. Thanks, Elise, for that introduction, and I also want to thank CME for inviting me to open your 2023 annual conference. I also am a fan of manufacturing, and I think it is the backbone of any country's economy, so it's great to be here together with all of you. I know that you've come from all over Canada to be here today, and I have to compliment CME for its optimism, because after spending 2 winters in Canada, I measure my term of service by winters. This is about to be my 3rd winter. I know that scheduling a conference like this in Ottawa in November takes a certain amount of optimism about the weather and about the future. Now, don't get me wrong, I really like Ottawa, even in the winter, but some of the best advice that I got before I arrived in Ottawa nearly 2 years ago was to remember that President Biden had appointed me to be the United States Ambassador to Canada, not the United States Ambassador to Ottawa. And that I should get out of the Ottawa bubble as much as I could. And that's exactly what I've tried to do. Over the past 2 years, I've traveled more than 120,000 kilometers from coast to coast to coast, helping me understand why the phrase coast to coast to coast is used, because this is a very large country. I visited all 7 of our consulates in Halifax, Quebec City, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Calgary, and Vancouver multiple times. I've traveled to every province now, and I'm working on my list of territories. So I'm coming for you, Northwest Territories and Yukon. Maybe not in the winter, but I will be there. Everywhere I go across this magnificent country, I try and meet diverse business audiences, not just big businesses, not just businesses in technology or healthcare, but also small businesses, owners, entrepreneurs, innovators, across the spectrum of business sectors, because I do believe that businesses are the lifeblood of the North American economy. I'm always impressed by the industry and drive that support the economic relationship that makes the United States and Canada each other's #1 trading partner. As you all know, so many of the major industries in the United States are supported by partners here in Canada, and so many industries in Canada are supported by partners in the United States. We're not just neighbors, friends, partners, or allies. We're also each other's best customers. So today, I want to talk about just how interconnected our two countries, our two economies, and our futures really are. President Biden spoke about those connections, as Elise pointed out, when he visited Ottawa earlier this year and addressed Parliament. I'll give the full quote that Elise referenced, which is the President said, "Our destinies are intertwined and they're inseparable, not because of the inevitability of geography, but because it's a choice we've made again and again. And it is the durability of that decision-making that defines our relationship. Over the past few years, our nations have looked to each other, and we have made a choice, time after time, through agreements like CUSMA. I'm in Canada, so I'll call it CUSMA. In the United States, we call it the USMCA. In the United States, we've chosen to move into the future together with new laws and incentives like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act. In Canada, you have also made choices like the Emissions Reduction Plan, the Critical Minerals Strategy, and numerous new or expanded incentives to help investment in the green economy. These steps, I believe, have deepened our partnership and will help cement a vibrant, job-generating, green energy future and will bring our economies even closer together. Right now, at our embassy in Ottawa and our 7 consulates, we're working with our Canadian colleagues to strengthen the North American supply chain by focusing on 3 key elements. 1, boosting reliable sourcing. 2, building the workforce of the future. And 3, growing the opportunities for more bilateral trade, all on an equitable basis that reaches all of our communities. Let me tell you a bit about these plans and some of the progress we've already made. So the first element to creating a strong shared economic future is to ensure that our supply chain has reliable access to key materials. It's no secret that over the past few years, we've seen major challenges to North American supply chains, one of our historic strengths. Whether it was COVID-19 disrupting access to needed supplies, the trucker convoy, work stoppages in the transportation sector, or geopolitical tensions disrupting the flow of goods on the other side of the world, these circumstances have made manufacturing and exporting uncomfortably unpredictable. And as members of CME, you all certainly know that unpredictable is bad for business. The International Energy Agency recently estimated that the demand for minerals required for the clean energy transition will rise by 4 to 6 times the current level over the next decade and a half. Unfortunately, it is a reality that our current supply chains for these minerals, from extraction to production to recycling, are not diverse enough for the energy future that's coming. Too much of the critical minerals supply chain is in the control of unreliable countries that are decidedly not friends and allies of the United States or Canada. Understanding the importance of certainty in supply chains, President Biden proposed and passed a package of significant legislation, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the Defense Production Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act, all designed to stimulate the energy transition. Contrary to some erroneous popular myths, these important pieces of legislation apply to U.S. and Canadian companies and are designed to stimulate economic activity in North America. For example, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act gives tax benefits for electric vehicles if their battery materials are sourced from the United States or countries with trade agreements with the United States, including Canada. There is also an extra tax benefit known as the Clean Vehicle Credit for electric vehicles with final assembly anywhere in North America, so the United States, Canada, or Mexico. This arrangement clearly demonstrates the importance that Canada plays in our integrated auto sector. Contrary to some popular belief, the Inflation Reduction Act not only benefits American companies, rather, it also provides new opportunities for U.S. allies, including Canada. In fact, the specific IRA provision on sourcing from partner countries is something that will help boost investment not just in the United States, but also in key U.S. partners as well, again, including Canada. It's worth noting that the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act also helps stimulate beneficial policies and legislation here in Canada, and that was one of its purposes. So in response to the IRA, Canada announced its own 80 billion Canadian dollar investment in a series of initiatives for clean energy through the 2023 federal budget. This response was crafted to incentivize investments in clean electricity and spur new investments in the electric vehicle value chain, from mining to batteries to recycling. And as I said, this is exactly what the IRA was meant to do, to spur investments not just in the United States, but across the board in Canada and other countries as well. Quite plainly, this means that companies in Canada which can help supply critical minerals will have a huge advantage on the global stage. Almost overnight, many companies in U.S. partner countries became more attractive for investors deciding where to source their materials. And that was the design of the legislation in the United States. We've already seen numerous Canadian mining and processing projects benefit from signing deals with major players in the North American electric vehicle sector. We've seen vehicle manufacturers like Ford and General Motors, battery partners like Panasonic, and European partners building projects in Canada to supply the North American market with the electric vehicles needed to accelerate the energy transition. And we're not talking about small investments here. We're talking about billions and billions invested on both sides of the border. So in the year since the Inflation Reduction Act became law, companies have announced more than $110 billion US in new clean energy manufacturing investments, including more than $70 billion US in the EV supply chain. One example is the incredible work being done by General Motors to create a cathode hub in Bécancour, Quebec. The deal reached with Vale in November 22 is historic and adds to investments from GM, POSCO, BASF, Ford, and others in mineral processing and cathode manufacturing for the North American market. And by the way, the Inflation Reduction Act is not the only United States incentive program that has benefited Canadian companies. Under the Defense Production Act, President Biden made $250 million of funding available for U.S. and Canadian companies to mine and process critical minerals. He then announced a further $50 million in DPA funding for U.S. and Canadian companies to develop advanced packaging for semiconductors and printed circuit boards. And I'm happy to say, again by way of example, that in July of this year, a Canadian company, Graphite One, was awarded $37.5 million US from the Department of Defense under the Defense Production Act to support the development of its graphite mine in Alaska, another cross-border collaboration. Moving forward, the IRA and other incentives will ensure that both the United States and Canada are able to rely on each other more deeply when it comes to producing and securing the critical minerals we need to succeed and the minerals we need to manufacture our future. The second key element to our shared success is developing a workforce that is ready for our 21st century economy. I have not talked to a single business in Canada that does not list workforce and its ability to acquire and retain its workforce as its number one priority. I truly believe that any country or any business is nothing without its people. We cannot manufacture the United States' or Canada's future unless we advance the workforce and provide the tools that the workforce needs to succeed. That's why President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau outlined a plan at the last North American Leaders Summit to ensure that our private sectors, universities, and governments are doing everything we can jointly to attract and grow a workforce that has the skills to lead for generations to come. I am keenly aware that many of you in this room are eagerly searching for the skilled talent you need to adapt to this new economy. Without trained workers, your teams may be working longer than normal hours to make up for what's missing. It creates a morale issue and a retention issue. And I know that as leaders, you may have to make tough decisions on how things get done. To assist with the development of a new crop of skilled workers, the United States and Canada have committed to identify bilateral initiatives to promote student development through what's known as the 100,000 Strong in the Americas Innovation Fund. This fund will allow joint U.S.-Canadian groups to apply for funding to launch public-private partnerships that will boost our workforce preparedness. Also under the North American Leaders Summit plan, Canada and the United States have convened industry and academic experts in semiconductors and in other crucial advanced manufacturing and logistics industries for design sessions on the skills needed to develop the North American workforce over the next 5 years. Together, as reliable partners, Canada and the United States will bring together influential players from multinational companies, unions, state and provincial governments, and educational and training institutions to grow the pool of talent needed for critical supply chains, the talent needed to manufacture our shared future. Now, there is no way I could give a speech about supply chain resiliency and workforce development without mentioning the labor movement in both of our countries. As President Biden said before he joined the picket line in Michigan earlier this year, the United States was built by the middle class, and unions built the middle class. In a different speech, he also talked about the importance of unions because unions mean there is democracy. I strongly believe that is true, and that's why the United States is committed to getting the conversation on unions right. In fact, both Canada and the United States agree on the importance of labor rights. That's why the USMCA has historic protections for labor and collective bargaining between employers and employees. At the same time, we remain committed to making sure that businesses like those in CME have the reliable supply chains they need to operate. If we are going to move our economies into the future, we also have to think of ways to minimize the disruptions to supply chains as workers' needs are being met. And I can assure you that Canada has a partner in the United States in finding ways to minimize supply chain disruptions while protecting the rights of workers. So let me take a moment here to commend Labor Minister O'Regan on his hard work to resolve strikes at both the BC ports this summer and the St. Lawrence Seaway last week, as well as the work stoppage at CN Rail earlier this year, helping the parties involved reach deals when talks were at an impasse. While I don't love the temporary disruptions that took place, they were managed to a relatively short period of time. And while I'm thanking Minister O'Regan, I also want to recognize Unifor, the UAW, and the Detroit 3 auto sector manufacturers, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, for reaching a series of new work agreements in Canada and the United States with minimal interruptions to the critical auto sector supply chains that both our nations share and covet. It is worth noting that these three major companies managed to negotiate successfully on both sides of the border with two different unions using two different methods simultaneously. That is no easy feat. The third and last element of our successful economic future is working to grow the pie for U.S.-Canadian trade. A truly incredible $3.25 billion Canadian dollars in goods and services crosses our shared border every day, $3.25 billion a day, generating and supporting millions of jobs on both sides of the border. More than 30 U.S. states count Canada as their largest export partner. That is what I would consider a very large pie. It is a large pie that is the envy of countries around the world. But under the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership and the USMCA, we are working to grow that pie even more. In fact, our trade, Canada-U.S. trade, grew 20% year over year in 2022, and the vast majority of that trade is free trade. We plan to build on this momentum by ensuring that small and medium-sized enterprises, especially those owned by women, people of color, Indigenous peoples, and other underrepresented groups, also benefit from the recovery of both economies. A key fact, 99% of Canadian businesses identify as SMEs, and the U.S. has a comparable statistic. So it is not an overstatement to say that SMEs are the lifeblood of the Canadian and U.S. economies. That is why our two governments have committed to bringing small and medium-sized enterprises into the fold of our trade relationship and ensuring that they participate fully in the economic recovery from the pandemic. In fact, in the USMCA, the United States, Canada, and Mexico included dedicated chapters on SMEs and competitiveness, and that's a first for a U.S. trade agreement. These chapters help promote ongoing cooperation to increase SME trade and investment opportunities across North America. As the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative pointed out at the second USMCA SME dialogue in September, when our governments engage directly with a diverse group of small business stakeholders, everyone is included in and can benefit from the trade agreement. In fact, the group, which was led by Canada's Deputy Minister for International Trade and the U.S. Deputy Trade Representative, held talks in Mexico City focused on the experiences of women-owned small businesses in North America trade. So we've made a lot of progress, but we shouldn't rest on our laurels. We're not done, but together we are working to strengthen supply chains and generate jobs across North America. We're making strategic investments in each other's economies, developing our workforces for the future, and growing the pie for our economies and for every community within our economies. Together, I believe our future is inexhaustibly bright. So I've known Joe Biden for more than 30 years, and one of his strengths is in capturing the mood with perfect framing. So let me close my remarks this morning with something else he said when he visited Ottawa last spring. This was at the conclusion of his remarks to Parliament, and as he delivered these lines, Parliament rose unanimously. As hard as it is to get confirmed unanimously, it's hard to get everyone in Parliament. As hard as it is to get it confirmed unanimously in the United States, it's hard to get Parliament to agree unanimously on anything either. But as he was delivering these lines, everyone in Parliament rose to their feet. And he said, Canada and the United States can do big things. We stand together, do them together, rise together, and we're going to write the future together, I promise you. And he is absolutely right. There's so much that we can do, that we will do together, as neighbors, as friends, as partners, and as allies. So while you manufacture Canada's future, know that the United States will be there as a partner, not just today, but for the years to come. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and for those encouraging words, and thank you for agreeing to maybe take on a few questions from us today. First of all, let me first say that the hopefulness in your speech is important and really supportive for this group. But and I know it's pretty heavy on policy and a little bit of politics. But let me start with an easy question, if you would, if you'd entertain one.
I didn't know that there were easy questions.
Well, there are a lot of easy questions. There's no easy answers. But tell me, has your perception about Canada and Canadians changed since taking on the role, and what has surprised you in a good or not so good way?
So my overall perception of Canada and of Canadians has not changed. That perception is that, again, quoting Joe Biden, the United States has no better or more important friend, ally, or partner than Canada. And I have absolutely found that to be true. There is one thing that I was not expecting, so there is one surprise, and it's an important one, which is that as I began to travel around Canada, I was surprised to learn the pervasiveness of the loss of trust on Canada's part of the United States. Whether I was speaking to a business audience or to individual business owners or to NGO organizations or to local governments, provincial governments, to just regular people who I would run into in hotel lobbies and in cocktail lounges, the constant refrain was, what has happened to our relationship with the United States? Have we done something wrong? So literally what people were saying. And it, when I reflected on it, I mean, I know about the tensions that developed in the past administration. What I did not realize is the pervasiveness of the impact of those tensions and a palpable feeling on the part of Canadians that the United States was no longer the reliable partner and ally that it had been for so long in history. The polling bears this out. ECOS polling has been doing a trust survey, trust quotient, for over 50 years. It reached its peak at the end of the Obama administration with a trust score in the mid-50s. At the end of the last administration, before Joe Biden took office, that score was 10. So it gives you the quantification of what I was hearing as I was talking to Canadians. And the good news is that those numbers are now back into the low 50s. So the ECOS people have told me that I should take credit for that, because all of that happened since I've been the U.S. ambassador to Canada, but I know better than that. The people who deserve the credit are President Biden and the government of Canada and the people of Canada, who've worked very hard to put this relationship back together again. And I'm more than satisfied to be a cheerleader and communicator for the importance of that relationship, the value of that relationship, and trying to help make people feel better about the trust that exists once again between the United States and Canada.
Well, that's certainly encouraging, and I think Canadians would agree, and at least certain our sector would agree, that the importance and the rebuilding of what appeared at the time to be, America seemed to have lost its way for a while, but certainly it's back. I'm going to ask a policy-related question. So some manufacturers express concern over the president's executive order related to the invent it here, make it here, and the risk to a level playing field upon which to compete for federal, state, or local projects. And we've raised this concern with our officials in Washington, of course. But is there a pathway for manufacturers based in Canada so they can still compete? Because, of course, as I think you mentioned, the business, selling to the U.S. is an incredibly important part of our whole sector. So is there something, is there a pathway? Because I know the concern has been raised here. So
I can give a very short answer, but I won't stop there.
Okay.
The answer to that question is absolutely yes. But let me provide a little more detail on it. And Your question references the executive order
Yes.
on R&D, so I'll address that. But if I can embedded in the question may also be Buy America, Buy American concerns. So I'll address that too. So both of those will take me a little bit of time,
That's
but
okay.
I'll do that. So the executive order on invent it here, buy it here, I think poses no risk, not minimal risk, no risk to the strong R&D partnership that exists between the United States and Canada. Canada was not the target of that executive order. First of all, start with the fact that the executive order is not retroactive. It is prospective only, so all existing R&D partnerships, R&D efforts are not covered by the executive order. Second of all, there is tremendous discretion on the part of federal agencies and research endeavors as to how to apply the executive order. Third, collaborative research efforts that are the subject of agreements between the United States and Canada are exempt from the executive order. And so Canada and the United States are working on a mega joint research development partnership. It by its terms will not be covered by the executive order. And just as a symbol of the importance of this, the head of the National Science Foundation, which is the leading research arm in the United States, is visiting Canada in the next month, and he's coming here specifically to meet with his counterparts in the Canadian government, in Canadian business and industry, to be able to continue to explore and grow the research and development partnerships and collaboration that is such a strength of the U.S.-Canadian partnership. So it is interesting. I had a number of people say to me, well, gee whiz, you issued that order and we heard almost nothing about it. I wasn't upset about that. But among the groups you heard almost nothing about it from was the Canadian government. It's not because they were asleep at the switch. They did express concerns about it. We had many high-level conversations about it where we said, where the U.S. government in Washington said much the same things that I've said here, as well as making the point that embedded in the executive order are ample opportunities for waivers, and that Canada would be a likely partner to seek waivers if necessary. And I think at the end of the day, Canadian government certainly said privately, we're going to take the United States for its word, that this is not targeted at Canada, that most of our work will be exempted, that the comprehensive research and development partnership we're negotiating will not be subject to the executive order, and that if we come upon something that we think impedes collaborative research between Canada and the United States, that there'll be an opportunity for a waiver, and let's just make sure it works out that way. So I'm confident that it will work out that way, but everyone will have to test me. You may have to invite me back sometime
We will.
to be able to see how
follow-up.
to see how that executive order played out. The second issue, which could be embedded in your question, is the issue of Buy American, Buy American. So I actually gave a 20-minute speech on this at the Wilson Center. I won't repeat it in this answer, but I truly believe that concerns over Buy American, Buy American in Canada are overblown. And I start from the prospect that the Buy American, Buy American provisions are limited in scope. They only apply to federal procurement. They don't apply to private sector trade. This isn't protectionist tariff policy like what existed in the prior administration. It is a limitation that applies to some, maybe a lot, but some federal procurement. And that is all that it applies to. Number two, it's not new. The Buy American policies have been in place for 40 years. In that 40-year period, we still have $3.25 billion a day in trade and goods and services across the border. It doesn't really impede the size and the strength of the cooperation. Number three, there are waivers that are available, have been made available. I referenced the electric vehicle battery provision. It's not even a waiver. Basically, for purposes of electric vehicle battery production, Canada and Mexico, but Canada in particular is written out of the Buy American provisions that are embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act. And that has been the practice across the board. So I tried to have my team, because I was getting enough questions about this, so I tried to have my team quantify the amount of trade that is covered by Buy American policies, and it's something less than 1%. So I made an invitation, which I'll make here today, which is if any company, if any of your member companies is interested in bidding for a contract and believes that it cannot bid or it won't be eligible to bid or it's excluded from bidding or doing business because of Buy America or Buy American policies, feel free to contact the embassy and our Foreign Commercial Services team will work with you, because the odds are that there isn't a ban, there isn't a prohibition, there's a way for you to work around it.
Well, thank you for that clarification. That was my question. You knew we were going to talk about Buy America. Of course, we talk about Buy North American, and how do we encourage that? Because, and I agree with the comment you made. You know, Canada is typically not the target of these exclusionary polipolicies. But you know, but as you heard, we're very sensitive to how the U.S. perceives us.
And by the way, I appreciate the sensitivity. I don't think it's unreasonable. But I think part of the reason why it's not unreasonable is because Canada is still bearing scars. They may be legitimate scars from the prior administration.
You may be right.
I don't think the way Buy American are administered by this administration. And again, remember the bottom line. It applies to less than 1% of trade between our countries. So even if it was rigorously applied, you're not talking about a big economic impact. I want to say one other thing about this, which is the notion of Buy American, as I said, nothing new about it. It's been around for 40 years. But it's not unique to the United States. Most countries have preferences for their own businesses embedded in their procurement policies. And when I say most countries, that includes Canada. So Canada has multiple Buy Canada policies embedded in its federal procurement. Probably the best known example was around COVID, where Canada applied its Buy Canada standards to limit purchase of COVID, personal protective equipment, medications, et cetera, to Canadian companies. U.S. companies were not permitted to bid for those contracts. Now, there were good reasons for that. So the United States did not visibly complain about it. We were content to let the market work. We figured eventually, as the emergency deepened and grew, there would be an interest in Canada's part in expanding its access to those goods and services to American companies, and that is what happened. But the fact of the matter is that Buy Canada policies were in existence and were applied during the pandemic.
Fair point. Fair point. Well, let's talk a little bit about the border. You mentioned a little bit about infrastructure. You know, certainly the northern border for Canada-U.S. is much less, charged than the southern border, but there are still challenges. What in your mind could be done to streamline the movement of goods and people across our borders? And you mentioned, a number of incidents, but really, how do you see that going forward as a North American strength, I guess?
So let me start with a vehement agreement, which is one of the most important strengths of our relationship is the border and the way we administer the border for the movement of people and goods across the border. And there's a lot of focus in the United States on the southern border, and I can understand Canadians and, quite frankly, sometimes some of us in Mission Canada feel the same way. Hey, what about us? We've got a big, important border here as well. And so there is a lot of focus on making sure that it is efficient and manageable to move people and goods both ways across the northern border. And I think we've been doing a pretty good job with that. I think as problems are identified, we take steps, both Canada and the United States, to manage those problems. I get fewer and fewer complaints about border issues now between Canada and the United States. And I'll also note that both the United States and Canada are devoting billions of dollars, what's combined billions of dollars, to improving infrastructure, technology, to make it easier to cross the border and to transport goods and services across the border. So it's a big focus for both countries. I think, you know, coming off the pandemic and the trucker convoy, when there were real impediments and difficulties implicating transport of people and goods across the northern border, we've made a lot of progress. And as I said, the complaints that we receive now are dramatically diminished, which I think occurs as a result of our mutual focus on making sure that we can make as efficient and easy as possible the crossing of people and goods across our border.
Well, thank you. And yes, and for this sector, probably more than any, that conduit is so important to keep it open and keep it functioning. So thank you for those comments. Now, you wouldn't get away without me asking a question about some politics. One thing that fascinates Canadians is the U.S. political process, and of course, principally the federal elections. So for the upcoming U.S. election, I'm not asking for a prediction, but what might manufacturers want to or need to know?
So when you asked me earlier whether there was anything that surprised me about Canada, and I guess one of the things I should have mentioned is the tremendous interest and knowledge that Canadians have about politics in the United States. And frankly, I'm a little embarrassed by what I'm about to say, but Canadians, wide array of Canadians, have incredible detailed knowledge about what's happening in elections. I got a question today just sitting at the table about, well, it's election day, what do you think is going to happen? I hate to say this, but in the United States, I get no questions about Canadian politics. And my wife I said, I'm a little embarrassed by that because what happens here is important. We should know more about Canadian politics and Canadian government than we do. And my wife says, and I have no testing of this, but my wife says in Canada, just people we interact with on a daily basis know the key elections that are taking place in an off-year election, whereas in the United States, and a man on the street, I think an astonishing percentage of people would not be able to name the Prime Minister of Canada. So that has been a surprise to me, and I'm not disturbed by it, and I don't think there's anything dangerous about it. So I've spent a lot of my career in politics. I've advised a lot of candidates. I'm constantly reminded by my embassy team that I'm no longer in the political business. I'm the U.S. ambassador. I'm not a political consultant. But I sort of can't control myself anyway. And since you've opened the door by asking me a question, I figure it would be rude of me not to say something about politics.
Thank you.
So here, I mean, we're obviously, as a world, we're in an unprecedented time of disruption in politics, and this is not just the United States. It's not just Canada. Western Europe, Argentina, I mean, a variety of countries are facing tremendous disruptions with, significant outsized influence by populist, usually very conservative movements. They're often not parties, they're movements more than they are parties that are very disruptive to the political process. And the United States is not alone in facing those risks. I mean, it's that type of movement that led to the election of Donald Trump. that leads to him being the consensus and indisputable frontrunner to win the Republican nomination for president in 2024. And I'm sure everyone has seen the recent polls that were published in the New York Times this weekend that shows Mr. Trump ahead of President Biden in 5 of the 6 key battleground states. One of my observations, by the way, would have been, before that poll it would have had more power to it, is don't get seduced by polls that show that Donald Trump is ahead of President Biden nationally by 2 points or by 4 points, or that President Biden is only up by 2 points. We don't elect our president by popular vote. We elect our president through the Electoral College, and 90% of the Electoral College votes are locked in today, and they'll be locked in before the election. The key to presidential elections are a handful of battleground states, whether it's 5 or 6 or 8. It is some number of states like that, and you can really only assess what is going to happen in an election with reference to those states. As I said, that point would have had a lot more resonance if the New York Times hadn't just published a poll in 6 of those battleground states showing a very consistent lead by Mr. Trump over President Biden. And, you know, I would say that for the Biden campaign, for President Biden's supporters, for people in Canada or the United States who are concerned or troubled by a prospective second term for Donald Trump, those polling results are sobering and scary. But I will say, we are a year out from the election, and in politics, a year is longer than an eternity. I cannot tell you how many things could change over the course of the next year. A year out, of course, the Democratic primaries had not been decided, but Joe Biden was anything but a favorite to be the Democratic nominee to be President of the United States. A year out, Bill Clinton was not a favorite to be President of the United States. And on the Republican side, you saw names like Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney, who were in front-runner status a year out from the election. Neither one of them has the appellation former president attached to his name. So looking at polls a year or more out from elections is a truly hazardous business. But as I said, looking at those battleground states and looking at what we in the political business would call the internals, which is how do people feel about the candidate's ability to handle issues of concern, all of which also strongly favor Donald Trump in that poll. It is, for me, because I am also a glass half full kind of guy, for me it is more laying out a roadmap of the work that needs to be done over the next year than causing anyone to push the panic button. As I said, I know the president for more than 30 years. He's not capable of panicking. He's got a fantastic team around him, both in place and former members of his team like Ron Klain that have been through many situations just like this. I'm certainly not looking at the current state of play and saying, oh my God, it's all over. There's no way Joe Biden can get reelected. I think anyone who has that attitude is probably making a big mistake. And last thing I'd say, which I can't quantify to it, is Joe Biden has been underestimated for his entire career. He's been declared dead or irrelevant more times than any elected official just in his presidency. He wasn't going to win the nomination. He wasn't going to beat Donald Trump. Once he was elected, he wasn't going to be able, he had this approach that he actually wanted to try bipartisanship to pass legislation, and he was going to fail in every one of those efforts. He wasn't going to pass the Inflation Reduction Act. He did. He wasn't going to pass a meaningful CHIPS Act. He did. He wasn't going to get a budget last year. He did. There was going to be a government shutdown a few weeks ago. There wasn't. So I do think that if you want to have a short career in political prognostication, underestimate Joe Biden. That would be a major mistake.
Well, that's good to, and of course, as we talked earlier, what business wants is predictability and stability. And the one thing that that the Biden administration has given us is what I would call a more traditional approach from the U.S. and how it deals with its allies. So we appreciate that. Last question is related to something you mentioned at the beginning, USMCA or CUSMA, however you want to call it. In fact, I think one of the things they should try to strive to is get a single name.
By the way, Mexico has its name too.
Yeah, but I can't remember.
Right, neither can I. So we've got this wonderful trade agreement that's touted as precedent-setting and binding together three countries and having the tremendous opportunity to cooperate on trade, and we can't even agree on the same name.
Well, that was it might have been the politics of the day, but it's up for review again in 2 years as a part of the.
Actually, worse than that, it sunsets in 2 years.
Yes, exactly. I was at a conference in Washington, and I think I said sunset, and they no, it's not going to sunset. But I guess at some level, it's either gets to renewed or reviewed. Thinking about the future and about what we spoke about earlier, how do we make sure that is the agreement that provides that stability through post-2025, for the economic growth that we're all seeking?
So it's a very high priority for the United States. It's a very high priority for Canada. Not sure how high a priority it is for Mexico. I just don't know enough. I'm not making a comment one way or another. It is something that we are paying attention to. It's not something that's being ignored. This is the third time in the last 6 weeks that I've been asked this question in Canada, so I know it's on Canadians' minds. No, but I think it's important to note because the general consensus between the United States and Canada is that CUSMA or USMCA is working, that it's an important stabilizing influence for the trade relationship, and there's a strong interest in engaging in the review and making sure that at the other end of the review we maintain USMCA or CUSMA. On the other hand, I said 1 year in politics is beyond an eternity. 2 years in trade is way beyond an eternity. And it'd be really hard to get a lot of focus this much in advance of the sunsetting and the discussions that will take place. I think all from a business perspective you should be concerned about is whether either side is putting their head in the sand and ignoring this. And I can tell you that's not happening. There are the beginnings of discussions with the goodwill and the desire to make sure that USMCA and CUSMA do not sunset, but in fact remain in place with whatever adjustments are necessary to improve the performance of the trade agreement.
Well, that's good to hear. And in fact, the business community, we just recently met the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian manufacturing associations met in Washington to start that discussion, because exactly to your point, Ambassador, we want to keep this in the conversation, and we're going to be meeting here in Ottawa next November to talk a little bit more about how to improve it. So thank you for that encouragement.
And next November will be almost a year closer to when we have to have this discussion, so it may be of more interest at the time.
We'll hope to have you back. So thank you so very much for taking the time and answering our questions. I hope my colleagues can join me in thanking you for your openness and for your insights. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Cohen. Thank you, Dennis. Now, don't leave. I want you to stand up. We need to get a picture of the two of you. And I just want to say that was a really substantive conversation. Really appreciate it. I'm glad you took off you put on your political consultant hat. And I think you kind of gave us a prediction. I think you really did. So there you go. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention to you, ambassadors, we don't have any swag for you. No coffee cups with CME branding on them. And no fridge magnet for you. No, none of that. But instead, we're donating.
You gave me some
Okay, we gave you the Diet Coke, we got the Diet Coke, but we've also done even better than that. We've made a donation in your name to the Ottawa Food Bank. So we really appreciate your participation. Yeah. Thank you very much.